It was about 10 years ago. I was working as a custodian at a hotel on the outskirts of Boston when I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. I mean, I still won't go into a basement by myself unless I absolutely have to. It was the night shift, and for the most part, it was pretty laid back. I had to replace some of the supplies in the closets on each floor and handle some cleaning in the lobby, but for the most part, I was just there for maintenance and to help out the housekeepers. This means that more often than not, I was helping out with the laundry at some point, whether it was bringing the linens from one floor to another for the housekeepers or actually loading the machines. I was happy to help. What I wasn't happy about was going into the basement where the washer units were. It was just creepy down there. And it was the only floor in the entire building that was concrete, which made it extra noticeable when someone was walking around down there. And I found that out firsthand. That night, I offered to help by bringing the dirty linen cart down to the washer room. And as soon as I stepped onto the elevator, I regretted it. The elevator started taking me down into the basement, and as it started moving, I swear I could hear a tapping coming from the roof of it. I looked up confused, but just shrugged it off as something loose that was rattling as the cage was lowered. Plus, I was only going down 2 floors, so I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I reached the basement and wheeled the cart out onto the concrete floor before pushing it down the hallway. As I made it around the first corner though, I had to stop myself. There was that tapping again. I looked back over my shoulder to see if one of the housekeepers was walking behind me, but there was no one there. What was weirder was that the noise had stopped. I decided to keep pushing the cart, but as soon as I moved, I heard that tapping sound again, only now it was much louder. It definitely sounded like someone was walking behind me. I even listened closer to the cart to make sure that it wasn't the wheels making that noise as I pushed it, but there was no logical explanation for it. I walked a little bit further down the hall, but the footsteps kept getting louder and louder, and by the time I turned around to look over my shoulder again, it basically sounded like they were right behind me, but there was still no one there. I decided to pull my radio off the cart and ask if anyone was in the basement with me, but as far as anyone knew, I was by myself. That didn't make me feel any better about the noise. My chest started pounding as I pushed the linen cart down the hall, but this time I didn't hear any footsteps following me. I let out a sigh of relief and quickly pushed the cart around the corner and then into the laundry room. I positioned it in the corner where the housekeepers usually put it and turned to walk back out the door when I stopped myself. I could feel myself almost starting to shake as I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time it sounded like they were definitely coming toward the washer room. They were getting closer and closer. I couldn't take my eyes off the door, wondering what I was going to see when the footsteps finally got there. But before they could pass by the threshold, they just stopped. "Hello?" I called out from the room, only to get my own echo as a response. I called out on the radio again to ask if anyone was in the basement, but again, there was supposedly no one down there with me. I slowly walked toward the door and poked my head out of it, and when I saw that there was no one there, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran as fast as I could down the hall the way I came and called for the elevator, which thankfully was still on that floor. The doors opened and I hopped inside before pushing the button for the lobby. I was happy that I hadn't heard those footsteps behind me as I walked to the elevator. But as the doors started to close, I swear I heard the sound of someone running down the hallway as if they were once again running toward me. The doors closed and the elevator took me to the lobby, and that was the last time I went into that basement by myself because no one could explain to me who was making that sound. I used to work as a security guard over at the Galleria Mall in my city, and I don't think I'll ever be able to walk through a department store comfortably again because of it. It was an overnight shift, and I had finished the parking lot patrol that we usually did after the final round of movies let out of the theater. I made sure that all of the customers and employees got to their cars and got out safely before going back into the mall and doing my rounds. I was on duty with 2 other security guards, and that night I was the one assigned to the western side of the mall, which included the Target, an arcade, and a few other smaller stores. As I walked past the gate entrance to the Target, though, I could have sworn I heard something moving around inside. I shined my flashlight into the store to see if anyone was in there, but all I could really see were the checkout aisles. That was when I heard the sound of something being knocked over. I called the other two guards on our walkies and let them know that I heard something in the store and got permission from my supervisor to check it out. I used my keys to unlock the gate and sealed the store and made my way in with the flashlight shining out in front of me. I walked toward where I thought the noise came from, which happened to be the men's clothing section, and at first I thought I saw someone, but it was just a mannequin. As far as I could tell, there was no one there, so I started checking out the rest of the store. I was making my way through the electronics section of the other side of the store when I heard the sound of something slamming again, as if something was knocked over, and it sounded like it came from the clothing department, so I rushed back over there. When I was about halfway there, though, something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, as I passed an aisle, I thought I saw someone standing right in the middle of it. I stopped myself, looked back into the aisle, and was surprised to see not one, but two mannequins positioned right in the middle of it. I was confused, but didn't have time to think about it because I heard another noise coming from the front end of the store. I ran as fast as I could to the front of the store and was horrified to see 5 more mannequins standing in a line blocking the entrance that I used to enter the store. I looked around to see who was moving them around because obviously someone was messing with me. But when I turned around, I couldn't help but scream. The 2 mannequins that I saw in the middle of an aisle deeper in the store were now standing right in the middle of the store's main walkway. Someone had moved them, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out where they were or how they were doing it. I called it into the radio and let my supervisor know what was going on, and my coworkers ended up meeting me in the store to check it out. After they got there, we all walked around looking for any sign of an actual person, but there was no one. Eventually, we resorted to checking the store's cameras, but when we went to look at the footage, we were shocked to see it wasn't archived or stored anywhere. The cameras hadn't been recording that whole day. We contacted the manager of that store as well as corporate to let them know of a potential break-in, but beyond that, there was nothing to be done. At the end of the day, we all just chalked it up to young kids messing around after hours. They probably snuck into the Target before it closed and just stayed there until we almost caught them, but to this day, I don't know how they managed to avoid all of the cameras. All I know is I'll never look at a mannequin the same ever again. It was the middle of the summer, and I was strapped for cash, so I picked up an overnight shift from a coworker at the gas station. I usually didn't like to work overnights because my coworkers were always telling me stories about the weirdos that would come in at night, but I figured I could handle one shift. What's really crazy, though, is that it wasn't any of the customers that came in that night that gave me any trouble. It was what I saw across the street that was weighing on me. The Sunoco gas station that I worked at happened to be across the street from the backside of our town's cemetery. And while I'm not one for superstition, I also never liked the idea of a cemetery at night, only now I have a justifiable reason for it. I got into work and took over at the register. My plan was just to put a single earbud in and do my best to get through the shift as quickly as possible. But what I didn't anticipate was how slow it was going to be. By the time midnight rolled around, there were hardly any customers coming in, which would have been fine, but that's when I started to notice something weird across the street. There was a small fence between the road and the cemetery, but because the gas station was on a slight hill, I could see right over it, and when I randomly glanced out the window, I thought I saw someone walking around. I got up from the stool behind the counter and walked closer to the window to get a better look. I could feel my palms starting to sweat, and my nerves spiked a little bit as I leaned toward the glass to look outside. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't make out what I was seeing. There was definitely something moving around in the cemetery, but I had no clue what it was. I remember thinking to myself, God, I hope it's not one of those creeps that night shift always talks about, as I walked back to my seat. I tried my best to pay attention to my phone as I sat in the empty store, but I couldn't stop myself from looking up at the cemetery every few seconds to make sure that whatever was in there wasn't crossing the street. That being said, after a few minutes of whatever it was pacing back and forth, it did the only thing worse than coming out of the graveyard. It disappeared. I looked down at my phone for a few seconds to change the playlist that I was listening to, but when I looked up, the figure in the cemetery was gone. I walked back over to the window to look for it, because I didn't like the idea of not knowing who or what it was, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I tried to tell myself that it was just someone looking for a relative's grave or something, and they must have found it and left. It was the only way to convince myself that it was okay for me to keep working through the rest of the night. As the next couple of hours passed, I couldn't help but glance over to the cemetery every couple of minutes to see if the figure was back. But I was pretty happy that it wasn't there. I kept myself occupied by restocking the cooler section and making sure that everything on the few shelves was in the right spot. Nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen, though. As soon as I finished restocking the soda and soft drink section of the cooler, I was getting ready to lock the store so I could run to the bathroom when, out of nowhere, the power cut out. Everything in the store went dark around me, and I could feel my heart starting to race. I looked around and hoped that the power would kick back on as I made my way over to the counter. But I stopped dead in my tracks when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned myself toward the glass doors that led into the store and stared across the street into the graveyard. It was much easier to see now that I wasn't standing in a bright room anymore. I couldn't help but shout when I noticed the figure from before standing right at the fence line. I couldn't make out any distinguishable features, but from where I was standing, it looked like a person who was just staring over at the gas station. I tried to tell myself that they couldn't see me, but somehow it felt like they were staring right through me. I made my way over to the door as fast as I could and locked it without looking away from the person in the cemetery, and then backed up toward the counter and grabbed my phone to call the owner to ask what happened with the power. I looked down to dial his number, and as it rang, I looked back to the cemetery, but again, the person had disappeared. I started breathing heavily, trying my best not to panic as my boss answered his phone. I told him about the power, and he told me that he must have forgotten to pay the bill, and then told me that I should just close up for the night and everything would be back on in the morning. I didn't have to do much since the power was out in terms of closing the gas station, but I was hesitant to walk out into the parking lot without knowing where that person went. After a minute of hyping myself up, though, I did it. I opened the door and then turned to lock it as fast as I could before sprinting to my car and starting it. I was glad that nothing happened to me as I was leaving work that night, but I'll never forget the moment I looked back into my rearview mirror as I drove away and saw what was clearly that same figure standing in the middle of the road. It was as if they were watching my car drive away. I tried to talk to some of my coworkers about that night, but none of them had ever had any problems with the graveyard across the street.